this episode of the Encounter Report, 3 Dragoneers aspire to be Diva Magicas in Shining Resonance. There's Axelrod, your humble narrator, who played Refrain Mode on Standard Difficulty on the PlayStation 4. Alan Bahuth, who played Refrain Mode on Standard and Casual Difficulty on the Switch. And Lanfy Goods, who played Original Mode on Standard Difficulty also on the Switch. Each of us played the game blind, and with that out of the way, it's time to knock Kirika Toa Alma, Dragoneer of Welland, Diva Magica, and inheritor of the rune songs from the Dragon of Old, down a peg. We're starting with battle types, and we have some notable narratives going on. First off, average level deficit makes its first appearance, showing us how far above or below the battle type we were on average. This metric is important because it shaped each of our mentalities going through the game. Much of the time, each of us felt extremely behind and thus partook in many more encounters than we may have otherwise done. I came out with the highest random encounter amount by a smallish margin, but I was also the only person to do more than one grimoire. In this case, the boss of the final floor of each grimoire run is labeled as a floor leader. For Alan Bahuth, there was much less friction. For random encounters, he found himself on average 3.9 levels above the enemy, but has less overall encounters than I do and never entered a grimoire on screen. I think you know where this is leading, but we'll save the rest of that for later. With Lanfy Goods, we have the most significant deficits of everyone, and part of that is reflected in the death percent, or how many of those encounters resulted in deaths. Each death adds to the average, and the level scaling of the enemies increases pretty drastically, so everyone would constantly fall behind. Following that up are battle locations to see where encounters took place, and it's here where we get to see some of the same disparity amounts. Alan Bahuth has the smallest amount of total time spent in encounters despite his level deficit being above the enemy on average. I deviate slightly in that my deficit is on the smaller side, but my encounter percent also swings more into dungeons, which is likely a result of the amount of grimoires I did. Lanfy Goods still sports a large deficit in levels, but also has a significant amount of time spent in encounters. Shining Resonance has a more unique take on how it sections off its encounters. In many RPGs, you would typically visit any given location once and rarely need to visit it again. Here, the opposite is largely true, in that there is one central hub and you're going through the same zones each time when leaving that hub. In the back half of the game, you basically have to travel through all the zones previously visited to get to the next location. For combat types, we'll take a brief look at how encounters concluded. Here, both myself and Alan Bahuth had a relatively positive outcome, with only one death causing a game over. Here, we can see that everyone did a little bit of running from encounters thanks to some of the challenging level differences. For the maximum and minimum level deficits, I was at most 14 levels higher than the enemy while 35 levels beneath. For Alan Bahuth, he was 16 levels higher than the enemy and 35 levels lower, while Lanfy Goods was 13 levels higher and 46 levels beneath. Which perhaps segues us into their death count. Lanfy Goods ran into a lot of the same roadblocks as the rest of us, but encountered these fights with some type of disadvantage. These came in the form of levels being very low, entering the fight without saving for a long period of time, thus forced to scrap it out, and/or not having replenished their item reserves. Additionally, out of everyone, Lanfy Goods was the person to use the Shining Dragon transformation the least, which was effectively the only reason any of us could avoid the same amount of deaths. With subtypes, we can check out some of the extra stuff that was being done and can finally address the elephant in the room: grinding. We've gone over the level deficit and how much it has played a role in various degrees of suffering, but all of us would have suffered a great deal more without some grinding. In this case, everyone either did on-screen grinding, off-screen grinding, or a combination of the two. Or said in another way, Lanfy Goods was the only person who didn't grind on-screen, and when done off-screen, both Lanfy Goods and myself only did it once. Alan Bahuth, on the other hand, did a lot of on-screen grinding. This was all done after the first Genus fight in Elmore Woods, where he was only one level below the boss, and of all the fights, he was an average 4.3 levels higher than the enemies he was fighting. Considering he effectively fought every enemy on the map up to this point, it definitely felt like a strange place to grind. However, he did a lot of off-screen grinding as well, gaining a minimum of 23 levels. It's also worth noting that he leveled all characters equally for the majority of the game. I also want to throw it out there that each of us have a decent number of risky encounters, but I'm uncertain what the actual trigger is for them. The game describes them as likely to happen when the enemy encounters you from behind, but each of us probably got less than 3 encounters that met that criteria. Each other time, we just ran straight into the enemy. Next up is the boss encounter time graph. On the left, we have the time, and on the bottom, each boss in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle, and within those rectangles, the length of time it took for each person to defeat the boss on their latest kill attempt. For the first set of bosses, we're all primarily in the same general areas. I have a huge spike on the Griffin, where I had to fight it solo for a long time, while Lanfy Goods has a spike on Flare Dragon and Alon Bahuth a spike on Genus 1. The subsequent bosses keep that general progression until we hit Gungnir. This boss gave everyone problems and certainly became the most difficult fight of them all. Lanfy Goods in particular had a rough time navigating the fight due to not saving beforehand, forcing them to play healing or more support-oriented characters that resulted in low damage output. That strategy ended up being a consistent way for Lanfy Goods to progress further into fights, and as shown in this set of bosses, caused some lengthy encounters. I managed to get a pretty nice time on Zest 3, but Alon Bahuth got an exceptional time on Dainsleaf. That finally led us to the final battles of the game against Georg, where one clear contrast exists. Alon Bahuth and myself used the Shining Dragon to wipe the floor with the boss, and Lanfy Goods didn't use it a single time, drastically increasing the time it took to become victorious. We've also got the level progression graph for each person. On the left, we have the levels, and on the bottom, many of the bosses in the game. Each boss takes up a rectangle in the graph, and within those rectangles, we have Yuma's levels for each participant when that boss was defeated. Lastly, the red shows the level of the boss. Here we can see a lot of shenanigans happening. For both Alon Bahuth and myself, we had a jump in levels with the Yet 1 fight, which was one of the only moments where we were ahead in levels of the boss. By this point, all of my levels were thanks to EX eggs, whereas this was a boss fight closely after the long grinding session for Alon Bahuth. For Lanfy Goods, they never quite managed to catch up to any of the bosses. They were close to Genus 1, but progressively fell behind in levels much faster than everyone else, largely in part due to the enemy level scaling. By Zest 3, you can see my offline grinding session, as well as Alon Bahuth and Lanfy Goods doing one final grinding session before the Dragon Shift Zest boss. Party composition is next, and I'm fitting every character on here like the Diva Magica of Chaos I'm aiming to become, with faint gray highlights for the characters each person had in their final party. And interestingly enough, no character had full representation in all 3 parties except Yuma, and then there's Sonya, who nobody seemed to want around. But luckily for everyone, either Agnum or Leston was being used in the final party, which made the duo fight possible at the very least. For chapter data, I'm once again showing all of it at once to help showcase the progression. An interesting correlation is that for both myself and Alon Bahuth, we gain a lot of ground on the average level deficit from chapters 1 to 4. This is thanks to the amount of encounters we partook in, which is contrasted by Lanfy Goods in chapter 3. They had a significant reduction in encounters and ended up being lower level than the enemy on average, but oddly enough didn't snowball as drastically into chapter 4. For chapter 5 onward, each of us had a steady reduction for encounters, and the average level deficit then started to get out of control. And because Alon Bahuth did so much grinding off screen, those final 3 chapters were done in a flash, having only spent 1 hour 17 minutes combined in those encounters. The number of enemies per encounter is going to zoom on by here. This was a rare game where 12 enemies were displayed at the opening of the fight, and there were even horde fights where there could have been 50 or more enemies in them. Overall though, there was a decent emphasis on 3 and 4 enemy encounters, and that largely tapers off from there. And to close everything out, here's the final combined stats. Every one of us had some pretty large differences in our playthroughs, which leads to a strange 7% difference in encounter percent. I caught on to the power of eggs and the grimoire pretty early on, which gave me a solid amount of wiggle room. Alon Bahuth had a heavy emphasis on off-screen grinding, allowing him to keep pace with fights for a very long time. This resulted in a lot less struggle in addition to a wider range of resources to utilize, which is leveraged by his total character deaths. Lanfy Goods had the most difficult interactions with fights, which ultimately shaped their strategies and approach to many fights in the game. While I didn't track usages, I can definitely say they used Shining Dragon the least amount by a considerable margin. This combined with Kirika being their only healer left a lot of forced micromanaging due to her inability to restore mana. And yet, despite all of that, everyone came out on top despite the crazy level deficits we faced. It's not common to find ourselves so far behind in levels, and while all of us resorted to grinding to overcome that challenge, it was fascinating to see everyone develop in different ways. And that's the Shining Resonance Encounter Report. I hope you visit everyone's channels and social media to praise them for all this wonderful data. With another report done, all that's left is to start a band. I call dibs on the spiked shield that doubles as an organ. Thanks for watching, appreciate it, see you on the next video.